I thought winning $100,000 would change my life forever. But instead, it opened a door to the cruelest betrayal I had ever known. And before I could even share my joy, I found myself staring at the kind of truth that makes your heart stop and your breath catch. A truth that ended with a scream I will never forget. Thank you so much for watching and giving me your time. It means more than I can ever say. And before I go deeper into this story, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please tell me in the comments, because I always enjoy seeing how far my voice travels and how many hearts are listening. Life has a way of testing us in moments we least expect, and sometimes the very things we believe will bring us happiness turn into storms we never imagined facing. And that is exactly what happened to me when I thought my life was about to turn around with one small slip of paper that held the promise of hope. I was never the kind of woman who had much. I grew up knowing what it meant to stretch a dollar until it nearly tore. And even when I married, life never offered me the luxury of ease or comfort, only days filled with work and nights filled with worry. My hands carried the weight of endless chores, and my mind carried the burden of bills that always seemed to come faster than the money to pay them. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night with a dim light above me, counting coins and folded bills, praying that somehow the little I had would be enough to cover the rent, the groceries, and maybe a small treat for my child. Because even when you have nothing, you still want to give something. My husband, though, he was not a man who knew how to carry burdens. He was quick with his temper and quicker with excuses. And while I broke my back to hold our little world together, he carried himself like the weight was always someone else's to bear. Still, I stayed. Because love makes us blind, and hope makes us foolish. And in the quiet corners of my heart, I kept believing that maybe one day things would be different. That maybe one day he would see the effort I poured into every breath of our life. So when I held that winning ticket in my trembling hand, the numbers glowing back at me as if heaven itself had finally opened its doors, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Pure joy, raw and unshaken. I imagined the smile on his face when I told him. I pictured the way his arms might wrap around me as he thanked me for standing by him through all the hard years. I dreamed of how we could finally fix the broken things in our house, take a small trip together, and perhaps even save for something better, something lasting. In that moment, I believed the tide had finally turned, that maybe God had finally seen my tears and decided enough was enough. And I hurried out, clutching that ticket close to my chest, my heart pounding with excitement, whispering to myself that this was it. This was the miracle I had been waiting for. What I did not know was that miracles, too, can carry shadows, and that sometimes joy arrives with a sharp edge hidden beneath its shine. I can still see that day so clearly. The sun was bright, but the air felt heavy, and my heart was racing faster than my footsteps as I carried that ticket home, dreaming of how life was about to change. I walked down the street whispering plans in my head, almost like a child rehearsing a secret surprise. And I kept picturing his face when I told him how maybe, just this once, his eyes would soften and his mouth would curve into a smile that was real. I thought of the dinners we could share without counting every penny, of the roof we could finally repair so the rain would no longer leak through the ceiling onto our bed, of the small vacation we had promised each other years ago, but never managed to take. For the first time in so long, I felt light, almost as if the weight I had carried on my back for decades had lifted, and I allowed myself to believe that we were stepping into a new chapter. One where love would feel warm again instead of cold. But life has a way of turning even the sweetest moment into something bitter. And as I drove home that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight with both excitement and nervousness, fate dealt me a cruel blow. One moment the road was clear, the next, everything spun into chaos. A flash of screeching tires, the sound of metal crushing against metal, the glass shattering around me like tiny stars exploding in daylight. My chest slammed against the seatbelt, my head swirled, and all I could think as the world blurred was that the ticket was still in my purse and that I had to hold on. When I finally opened my eyes, there were voices around me. Strangers rushing, lights flashing, sirens wailing in the distance, and I could taste blood in my mouth while fear settled in my bones. The hospital became my new world. Sterile walls and the smell of disinfectant replacing the home I had longed to return to. I lay there with tubes in my arm and bandages across my body, weak but alive, clutching onto hope as if it were the only medicine keeping me breathing. I told myself over and over that he would come, that the man I had shared a life with would walk through those doors, take my hand, and remind me that I wasn't alone. One day passed, then another. Nurses came and went, their faces kind but unfamiliar, and still I waited. I told myself maybe he was busy, maybe he was scared, maybe tomorrow would be the day. But tomorrow turned into a week, and with each hour that ticked by, my heart sank deeper into a place where silence feels louder than screams. I stared at the door of that hospital room until my eyes burned, waiting for it to open, waiting for his footsteps, waiting for the sound of his voice to fill the void that was swallowing me whole. But it never came. And in that lonely silence, I began to realize that sometimes the people you count on most are the very ones who will let you bleed alone. I tried to silence the thoughts that crept into my mind as I lay in that hospital bed, but the longer I waited, the louder they became. And each unanswered moment tore at me like a knife. I picked up the phone one night, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped it, and I dialed his number with a desperate hope that maybe he simply did not know how badly I needed him. When his voice came through cold and sharp, my heart nearly stopped. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't ask if I was healing. He didn't even ask if I was alive by some miracle. Instead, he spat out words that cut deeper than my injuries ever could, words that still echo in the hollow places of my memory. He said he had no time and no money for a loser like me. I held the receiver to my ear, frozen, as if the sound might change if I just listened long enough. But it didn't, and when he hung up, I felt as though the weight of every sacrifice I had made, every meal I had gone without so he could eat, every long night of work I had done just to keep us afloat, all of it had been tossed aside like trash. My tears came slowly at first, then they would not stop, soaking into the thin pillow beneath me until I could hardly breathe. I told myself maybe it was anger speaking, maybe he was overwhelmed, maybe tomorrow he would regret it, but in the pit of my stomach, I already knew the truth. Days blurred together after that, nurses checking my vitals, the beeping of machines marking the hours I spent alone, and I felt myself sinking into a kind of loneliness I had never known before. I had always believed that no matter how bad things got, at least I would not face them alone. But here I was, bruised and broken, waiting for a man who had already decided I wasn't worth the trouble. It is a painful thing when your body hurts, but it is far more painful when your heart realizes that the one you trusted most has already abandoned you. And in that moment, lying in that bed, I knew that betrayal can wound far deeper than any accident ever could. It was after many lonely days that the door to my hospital room finally opened, and for a moment my heart leapt with a hope I could not control, thinking at last he had come to see me, to sit by my side, to remind me that even if his words had been cruel, he still cared enough to show his face. But what I saw standing there was not the man I had once promised my life to, at least not in the way I had imagined, because he walked in with a smile I did not recognize, and on his arm was a young woman dressed in bright colors, her laughter cutting through the air like glass shattering against stone. I lay there, too weak to rise, my eyes burning as I watched him lean close to her, whispering something that made her giggle, while I struggled to understand how he could walk into a room where I lay broken and make it feel like I was the intruder. He looked at me with no tenderness, no sorrow, not even the courtesy of pity, only a smirk that made my blood run cold. He pointed at me as if I were some joke, saying that I was finished, that I was nothing but a burden, and he laughed while the woman beside him clung to his arm as if cruelty was some form of entertainment. My chest ached, not from the accident, but from the sheer weight of humiliation. Because to be mocked while you are weak is a wound no medicine can heal. I could barely find the strength to speak, my voice a whisper when I asked him why, but he only shook his head and told me that my time was over, that I was yesterday's news, and that he had a new life now, one that didn't include me. I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I wanted to shut them out, but because I needed to gather every piece of dignity I still had left. I told myself not to cry, not in front of them, not when they wanted me to look small, because sometimes silence can be stronger than any word. And yet inside me, pain boiled into something heavier, a storm I could not release, as I realized that this betrayal was no accident, no moment of weakness. It was his choice. His deliberate cruelty displayed in the most heartless way he could manage. It is one thing to be left behind, but it is another to be mocked in your suffering. And in that moment, I knew I had seen the truest face of the man I had once called my husband. He did not stop with cruel words. He seemed to take pleasure in dragging the knife deeper, leaning over me with that smug grin as he told her how useless I was, how I had always been weak, how I was nothing more than a mistake he had carried for far too long. Every sentence was like a stone thrown at my chest, and the laughter that followed from the woman on his arm was sharper than any blade, echoing through the sterile walls of that room until it felt like they were closing in on me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to remind him of all the nights I stayed awake working to keep food on our table, of all the years I gave him without complaint, of the love I poured into a marriage that never truly gave me back what I deserved. But my body was too frail, and my voice trembled too much to carry the weight of all those truths. He pointed at me again, shaking his head as if I were a cautionary tale, telling her this was what happens when you waste your life. This was what happens when you cling to the past. And he chuckled while she pressed her hand over her mouth to hide another cruel laugh. I felt the heat of shame crawl up my skin, but behind that shame, something else began to stir. A kind of fire that pain cannot extinguish, a quiet strength that whispered to me that their cruelty said more about them than it did about me. As I lay there, my body weak but my mind beginning to clear, I realized that his mockery was not power. It was desperation. A man trying to convince himself he had traded up when in truth, he had only sunk lower. And though I stayed silent, though I let their voices echo while mine remained hidden in my chest, inside, I made a promise to myself that I would not let their laughter define me, that I would not let his betrayal be the last chapter of my story. Sometimes it is in the moment you are mocked that you discover your true strength. And as I watched him play the fool beside a woman who had no idea of the storm waiting just ahead, I held on to the thought that dignity, even when bruised and quiet, carries more power than cruelty ever will. Just when I thought their cruelty had reached its peak, the woman by his side took a few steps closer to me, her heels clicking against the floor, her laughter fading into a nervous silence as her eyes settled on my face. For a moment she seemed almost curious, tilting her head as if trying to place a memory, and then suddenly her expression changed. Her skin went pale, her hand flew to her mouth, and a scream ripped from her throat, so sharp it made the walls tremble. My husband jumped back in confusion, demanding to know what was wrong, but she could not answer, her eyes wide with shock as she pointed at me like she had just seen a ghost. The room fell into a heavy silence except for her shaking voice as she whispered words that shattered the air, words that made my heart pound even through the pain in my body. She looked at him, then at me, and said something that made his smirk vanish in an instant. It was as if the world itself had stopped breathing, and I lay there watching as the mask he wore began to crack, the confidence melting away, leaving behind nothing but fear and guilt. I did not fully understand it in that moment, but I knew her scream was not just from fear, it was from recognition, from a truth she had carried somewhere deep inside her that had now come crashing to the surface. I stayed quiet, letting the weight of the moment fill the room, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any accusation. He stammered, tried to hush her, tried to turn her face away from me, but it was too late. The damage was done, and what had been hidden for years was now exposed in the most brutal way. And as I looked at him, watching him fumble for control he no longer had, I realized that life has a way of bringing secrets into the light when you least expect it. And that scream, that one piercing scream, was the beginning of his unraveling. Her scream still echoed in my ears long after the sound had faded, and the look on her face told me that what had just been revealed was far greater than I could have imagined. She kept pointing at me, trembling, her lips forming broken words, while he tried to cover her mouth with his hand, whispering for her to be quiet, begging her not to say anything more. But the truth has a way of clawing its way out when it can no longer be hidden, and through her tears she blurted out what he had tried so hard to bury, the truth that she was his daughter from a secret affair long before she ever stood at my bedside. I felt my breath catch, my chest tighten, and in that instant the cruelty of his betrayal deepened into something darker, something that stained the very core of who he was. I lay there, my body weak but my mind spinning, realizing that while he mocked me, while he paraded her around as if she were his prize, he had been hiding a truth that poisoned us all. The silence in that room after her words was heavy, broken only by his stammering excuses, his desperate attempts to twist the story, to make it seem like less than it was, but the damage was already done. She looked at him with wide eyes full of disgust, backing away from the man she thought she knew, her voice shaking as she demanded to know why he had never told her, why he had dragged her into this cruel spectacle without warning. His face paled, his hands trembled, and for the first time in many years, I saw fear in him, not strength, not confidence. Just fear of losing the control he had once held over us both. And as I watched him crumble, his lies falling apart piece by piece, I felt something inside me shift. A strength I thought had been beaten out of me by years of neglect and cruelty began to rise again. Betrayal is a cruel teacher, but in that moment it showed me clearly that I was not the broken one, he was. I was not the fool, he was. I was not the one drowning in shame, he was. And though my body lay weak on that hospital bed, my heart began to beat with a new fire, one that whispered to me that the truth had finally set me free, and that his downfall had only just begun. I could see the panic spread across his face as he tried to piece his lies back together, his voice cracking as he begged her to calm down, telling her she was mistaken, that she was confused. But his words fell flat because the truth was already carved into her eyes. She shook her head again and again, tears running down her cheeks, her body trembling as she looked at me and then back at him, whispering that she could see it, that she could feel it, that she knew now why she had always carried questions about where she came from. He reached out to grab her hand, desperate to hold on, but she pulled away with a sharpness that made him flinch, and the sound of her sobs filled the room with a grief I could not ignore. As I watched him falter, I felt my own strength grow. Not in my body but in my spirit, because it was no longer just me standing against his betrayal. Now his own blood had turned against him, and there was nothing he could do to silence the storm that had finally broken loose. For so many years I had lived with his shadow towering over me, his voice louder than my own, his choices dictating the path of my life. But now I saw him small, cornered, stripped bare of the power he once held so tightly. It was a strange thing, lying there weak and bruised, yet feeling stronger than I had in years, because in that moment, I knew that he could no longer hurt me in the way he once had. The weight of truth was crushing him and freeing me all at once. I turned my eyes away from him and rested them on her. This young woman who had been thrown into a nightmare she never asked for, and I felt no anger toward her, only sorrow that she had been used as a pawn in his cruel game. She looked at me through her tears, her lips trembling as if to apologize, though no words came, and I offered her the only thing I could give, a quiet look of understanding, because I knew too well what it meant to be betrayed by the man who should have protected you most. And as the silence between us grew, I realized that sometimes justice does not roar into the room. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through cracks in the lies, through a scream that shatters the mask, through the tears of someone who finally sees the truth for what it is. The weight of the truth hung in that room like a storm cloud that would not move, and he stood there, shifting from foot to foot, his voice breaking as he tried to explain himself, calling it a mistake, calling it something from the past that should never have mattered. But the more he spoke, the smaller he became in both our eyes. She would not look at him anymore, her tears soaking into her hands as she sat trembling in the corner. And I lay there watching the man I had once trusted unravel into nothing more than a desperate liar, clinging to scraps of dignity he no longer had. For the first time in years he had no control, no smirk, no cruel laughter to lean on, only the raw truth that stripped him bare in front of us both. Inside me something shifted, and though my body still ached with every movement, my spirit stood taller than it ever had before. I thought of the ticket hidden away, the $100,000 that he knew nothing about, and I realized that while he mocked me and left me to rot, I had quietly been holding on to a future that belonged to me alone. I thought of the years I had wasted waiting for his love, waiting for his kindness, waiting for the kind of man he never truly was, and a calm settled over me as I decided he would never again take anything more from me. He finally turned to me, his eyes hollow, asking if I would forgive him, begging me not to throw him away. But his words rang empty. They were not born from love or regret, only from fear of losing the control he once held. I looked at him, my voice low but steady, and I told him that the man I had once married no longer existed, that the person standing before me was nothing more than a stranger, built of lies and selfishness. His face fell, his lips trembling, as though he could not believe I had spoken with such firmness, but I felt no doubt, only the quiet certainty that his hold on my life had ended. And in that moment, even as the machines beeped beside me and pain lingered in my body, I knew I had reclaimed something far greater than money. I had reclaimed myself. After that day, everything began to change, slowly at first, like a tide pulling back from the shore, but steady enough that I could feel the shift deep within me. He stopped coming to the hospital, and I knew it was not because of guilt or shame, but because he realized he could no longer use me as his stage for cruelty. The young woman, still shaken by what she had learned, visited me once more, her face pale, and her voice trembling as she said she could not believe the man she trusted had hidden such a terrible truth from her. I listened, I nodded, and though my heart ached for her, I reminded myself that she was not my enemy. She was another victim of his lies. Watching her walk away, I felt a strange peace, knowing that his own blood now saw him for who he truly was. And that was a punishment no words from me could ever match. When I was finally discharged, I went home not as the same woman who had left with excitement in her step, but as someone reborn through fire, scarred yet stronger. The walls of that house, once filled with silence and shadows, no longer carried the same weight, because I was no longer waiting for his voice or his approval. I gathered my things carefully, each piece a reminder of the years I had given, and I locked them away not with sorrow, but with a steady hand, because the past would no longer control my tomorrow. The ticket, safe where I had hidden it, felt heavier than gold in my palm, not just because of its worth, but because it symbolized the freedom I had won, the fresh start that was mine and mine alone. I made quiet plans, ones I did not share with anyone, because I had learned the hardest way that not every ear deserves to hear your dreams. I secured my winnings. I spoke with a lawyer, and I began to build a future on ground that he could never touch. And as I sat in that house for the last time, the evening sun falling through the cracked windows, I whispered to myself that dignity is worth more than diamonds, and peace is richer than any promise a man can make. It was not revenge that filled me then, but clarity. The kind that comes when the lies have finally burned away, leaving only the truth, and in that truth, I found the strength to begin again. In the months that followed, I watched my life transform into something I had almost forgotten was possible. A life not weighed down by his scorn or his endless lies, but filled with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had survived and reclaimed my worth. He tried to reach out once, not with love or remorse, but with desperation, asking if there was still a place for him now that the truth had burned every bridge he thought he could still walk across. I did not answer, because some doors are not meant to be reopened, and some wounds only heal when you finally let them close for good. The money gave me security, but it was dignity that gave me peace. And as I learned to wake each morning with gratitude instead of fear, I realized that betrayal may wound deeply, but it cannot destroy the spirit of someone who refuses to stay broken. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. It means more than you will ever know. And if my voice has touched your heart tonight, I ask you to leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, because I truly love knowing how far my story travels. And please, do not forget to subscribe so you can join me again for the next story, because together we can keep sharing the truths that remind us all that strength, no matter how quiet, always wins in the end.